It's not all about power. And in fact, if you try to govern your relationships based on power, your true relationships, you will fail. Mm-hmm. So imagine that your wife, let's say, you're going to just use power to interact with her. Well, try it and see what happens. You know, she's going to be miserable and she's going to be resentful for sure. And maybe she's got more power than you when push comes to shove. Who the hell knows? Women aren't that easy to oppress. And so they have their own bag of tricks, that's for sure. And so, but at minimum, you're going to be setting yourself up for a loveless relationship based on mutual suspicion. And then imagine you tried to use power on your kids. Well, now and then you might have to use discipline. You might have to lay out the game rules, which isn't the same as like constraining them with oppression. But if your fundamental relationship with your kids is one of dominance, you're just a tyrant. And then if you try using that on your friends, well, first of all, you won't have any friends. The best you'll ever manage is henchmen, and they'll only be around you because they think they can get something out of your power. So they're the worst kind of friend because they're not even confident enough bullies to be bullies on their own. They have to hide behind another bully and be sub-bullies, and that's a dismal outcome. And then if you use power in your business relationships, it's like no one's going to be aligned with you, and the first time you make a mistake and you show any sign of weakness, your so-called business associates that you've just dominated because you have the power, they're just going to stab you in the back and leave. So it's a preposterous theory. It doesn't even work for chimpanzees. So the best work that's been done on chimps so far has been done by Franz de Waal. De Waal has been studying chimpanzees for 3 decades, and he's written a series of books about the emergence of proto-morality in chimpanzees. Now, chimps have to live in a social group, and for decades, and they have, you might as well call them friendships, because that's the closest analog, and they have to maintain those friendships. And they can't maintain them by dominance because, well, then obviously it's not a friendship. They have to maintain it by mutual grooming and caretaking. And so what de Waal has shown is that the alpha chimp, so you think of the alpha chimp as the roughest, toughest chimp in the troop, you know, he's banging on sticks and threatening everybody, and he clambers his way up the hierarchy just like the Marxists would assume, and he establishes sexual superiority and propagates his genes. And the truth of the matter is, that's better than being weak and useless and dying, but it's not nearly as good as being genuinely reciprocal. And so what de Waal has shown is that sometimes the alpha chimp male is the smallest male in the troop, so that's pretty damn interesting. But more to the point, the alpha chimp is the most reciprocal member of the entire troop. So he's keeping track of his social relations, he's grooming his friends, they're interacting constantly, like he's maintaining social relationships like mad. And there's 2 advantages to that, apart from the fact that he attains a certain degree of a reverence, let's say, and authority, and some preferential sexual access, so it's a good biological strategy. The troop is also more stable emotionally, partly because it's not ruled by a tyrant, let's say, who's always disrupting things. But the alpha, who's reciprocal, also can have a long reign. Because if you're one of those chimps that use manipulation and power to climb up the hierarchy, as soon as you show a sign of weakness, 2 of the males that you've oppressed will gang together, which chimps are very good at, and tear you into bits. And so de Waal has written very frightening accounts, very graphic accounts of these like revolutions against tyranny in chimp groups. And so the people who claim that power is the only motivation, they don't have a leg to stand on. It's just not true. Two more things. One is, if you think power is the only motivation, that's your whole theory, then you're justified in using power at every step, because there's nothing but power. So why not use power? And so it's a confession more than an accusation. And second, when systems deteriorate, power emerges as a fundamental motivation. And so part of the reason the Marxists and the postmodernists can be so attractive in their critique is because power does corrupt. And so whenever you look at any enterprise, social enterprise, any family structure, even any relationship someone has with themselves, you can say, well, look, to some degree you're corrupted by misuse of power. And sometimes that can go way out of control, right, and be the dominant phenomenon that happens in totalitarian states. And you say, well, it's all about power. Well, it is when things get entirely corrupted. But that's a whole different proposition than everything's based on power. It's more like, well, hold it, everything corrupt is based on power. But not everything is corrupt. At some point, we weren't linguistic creatures at all, right? We separated from the common ancestors between us and chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. And sometime during that 6 million year process, we started to be able to imitate ourselves first, and then represent ourselves in image and action, and then only after that to start to articulate ourselves. And so a lot of the knowledge that we have is grounded in our embodiment, but also in the shaping of that embodiment across extraordinary long periods of time. So, like, there's an implicit way of being in your form, in your embodied form, but more importantly, there's an implicit way of being that's a consequence of the fact that we've existed within hierarchical social structures for far longer than we were even sharing a common ancestor, say, with great apes. So that's for maybe hundreds of millions of years with regards to being embedded in a hierarchy. So then the question is something like, well, if we're embedded in a hierarchy, and we have been forever, that's about 350 million years, by the way, is there a set of attributes that tends reliably to move you up the hierarchy? Because if there is, you see, going up the hierarchy increases the probability of reproductive success. So there's actually nothing more important to determine over the course of 350 million years inside a hierarchy than how it is that you ratchet yourself up the hierarchy reliably. And you could think about that in some sense as the source of ideals. Well, here's a kind of a concrete way of thinking about that. You know, if you get 100 men together, they're going to organize themselves into a hierarchical structure. They have to, or they're going to stay chaotic and fight. That's the other alternative. And so, but the way that the people who are going to rise to the top, they might rise to the top because of their sheer physical prowess and power, but they also might rise to the top because they're very competent at certain things. And it's as if all the men are going to get together and vote, and maybe that would actually happen, to determine who best embodies the spirit of the group and who should be granted leadership. And in an evolutionary context, by the way, that would also help ensure that that person would propagate their genes into the next generation. And it's not a trivial effect, especially among men. It's a big effect, because roughly speaking, half of all men are not reproductively successful. So there's a wicked culling, let's say, among men. Well, you can see this among chimpanzees as well. They have dominance hierarchies. Some sort of chimps rise to the top. And you might think, well, that's the caveman chimp who's best at pounding out all the rivals. But it turns out that that's not exactly the case. And Frans de Waal has done a very good job of detailing this with his work on chimpanzees in particular. And he's found that the power-hungry tyrant sort of chimp can rule for a while, but he tends to have a very unstable kingdom. And the reason for that is he's not very good at mutually grooming, he's not good at socially connecting with other males, and he isn't popular among the females and doesn't attend to the young, essentially. And so what happens is, even if he's like the meanest, toughest guy on the block, two subordinate chimps team up, they make friends, they groom each other, and they have each other's backs. And one day he's having an off day because he ate too many fermented bananas the night before, and they just tear him into pieces. Anyways, what de Waal found was that it's actually chimps that are more, you might say, humane. Although chimpane, I don't know what the equivalent is. Let's say humane, that manage to produce hierarchies that are more stable and actually manage to stay alive on top of them for much longer periods of time. And he thinks about that as the emergence of an implicit morality, right? It's a morality that's acted out. So then you think, well, there are different ways of climbing up a hierarchy. There are worse and better ways. The better ways allow you to live longer in a more stable hierarchy, and the evolutionary payoff for that is that you leave more descendants. And so the
hierarchy itself becomes a very powerful shaping mechanism that determines how it is that people are going to adapt, because it's the primary method of selection. So there's an ethic in there. There's an ethic that emerges from the social interactions, but that's rapidly transformed into a biological selection device. And so we're selected. And that's especially true among human beings, because with chimps, the females are indiscriminate maters, which is to say that a female chimp in heat will mate with any male chimp. Now, the dominant males chase the subordinate males away, so they're still more likely to leave offspring than the subordinates, but it's not because of the females. But human females are different. Human females exert choice, and quite brutal choice, you might put it that way. They're very choosy, and it's one of the things that seems to have distinguished us from chimpanzees. And what roughly seems to happen is that the male dominance hierarchy elects men to the higher, say, rungs of the hierarchy, and then the females peel from the top. And so that means that what you can say is that human beings are the consequence of intense male dominance competition. It's not necessarily dominance, but it's competition for the upper rungs of the hierarchy, mediated by female selection.